Hey everyone, this is Emmanuel Kraft. For my Bureaucratic case study, I'll be looking at the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. With this being in the news headlines recently, I thought it would be pretty cool to look at how this program has evolved over time, and specifically look at changes in the structure and kind of perception of this program since it started. And so throughout the presentation, I'll be kind of connecting to some ethical considerations and also some of the readings that we've read in class. So first of all, what is SNAP? Some of you may know it is the most important anti-hunger program in the United States, where essentially the federal government is providing funds to low-income households that they can spend specifically on food. And so it is the third largest welfare program in the United States and also the largest of the food assistance programs that are run by the USDA. So to understand the development of SNAP over time, its origins, and kind of how it got to where it is today, I think it's actually important to go back a few hundred years, back to the 1600s, when many countries and populations viewed the poor as being inherently unworthy and viewed poverty as being a matter of personal choice. This is a narrative that we actually continue to see today surrounding these welfare programs, but I thought it'd be interesting to mention that this really does go back hundreds of years. Now, as far as SNAP specifically in the United States, this really starts in the early 1900s, where hunger and poverty relief were essentially being managed at the local government level through private charities, and the federal government really had very little involvement. And so as some issues started to develop, this brought in some ethical questions of who is deserving of this welfare support. Again, going back to those discussions from hundreds of years ago, and then finally, who should oversee and administer the support? Should it be the federal government that takes a bigger role? And so the time when we really started getting answers to these ethical questions, and also seeing the federal government take a much larger role in the welfare space, but specifically with the food assistance programs, was during and following the Great Depression, when essentially farmers were producing a huge surplus of food, but because of the Depression, because of the economic conditions of the time, most people could not afford to buy that huge surplus of food. The solution that the federal government came up with was to actually distribute surplus resources to the poor while still paying the farmers a fair price for what they produced. And so it was getting the farmers the sales that they needed while still getting the food to the people who needed it the most. It worked really well over the next 4 years. 20 million people used that food stamp program. And so I definitely connected this development in the initial food stamp program to Selznick's descriptions and stories of the grassroots partnerships that the TVA created, where really in the same way that the TVA relied on grassroots partnerships to fulfill their agricultural duties, the federal government here with the food stamps took into account the needs and actions of farmers and how these actions interact with households at the local level to find a workable solution. And so by building those partnerships, they were able to address the huge problem that was facing the nation. So, despite the initial importance and impact of this first food stamp program, it really wasn't until President John F. Kennedy in 1961 actually used his first ever executive order of his administration, which I thought was pretty cool, to initiate a pilot food stamp program. And so, kind of reigniting this program also reignited some big policy debates. On one side, you had the urban Democrats who viewed food stamps as public welfare, as a necessity for getting resources to those who are most in need. And then on the other side, you have the Republicans and the rural Democrats who really are more interested in how this would benefit farmers. And then they were also just generally opposed to expanding the federal government's role. And so really the only way that this food stamp program was able to progress was through log rolling, where the urban Democrats agreed to vote on certain agricultural legislation related to wheat and cotton. And then in return, the rural Democrats agreed to vote in favor of food stamps. And the program was able to pass. Now, important point to mention here is that the food programs were subject to rules and funding set by congressional agriculture committees, who at the end of the day are interested in promoting agricultural business interests. And so even though these food stamps at the end of the day are meant to benefit those who are in need and need food, there is still that whole factor of business interests and how that lines up with the needs of the recipients of this program. And so again, with those ethical considerations, now at this point, it's more of a direct confrontation between the farmers and the needy. It's less of a win-win here. And so understanding how can we benefit both the agricultural sector while still getting the food to people who need it was a big debate at the time and still continues to be. And then the other big debate was, as I mentioned, was expanding versus limiting the scope of the federal bureaucracy. Should we be increasing the size of the bureaucracy? Should the government have more of a say in these programs? Should they be running these programs? And figuring out how to best do that. So those are two big considerations at the time. And so I definitely do connect kind of this section of the development of SNAP to Barnard's descriptions of those cooperative systems where people are influenced by past experiences. Because, Barnard argues that cooperation within a system is, at the end of the day, is a choice, which is influenced by appraisals of influence over a situation and also what a person can do in a certain situation. And so in this case, with the food stamps, the Democratic groups both held power and were motivated by their respective backgrounds for the rural Democrats and urban Democrats, but they really only chose to cooperate after each got something out of the legislation that would eventually pass. And so it showed that these cooperative systems, personal characteristics do go into it, but at the end of the day, everybody needs to have their interests met to really have that cooperation. So then over the next few decades, the welfare bureaucracy, and specifically the food assistance programs that were being administered by the federal government, saw a lot of changes, a lot of ups and downs, largely as a result of decisions at the federal level about how much did the government want to play a role in these programs. And so in the 1970s, program participation in the food stamps did decline pretty steeply due to the federal government choosing to reduce the budgets and then also to pass restrictive welfare policies in different spaces. So then in the 1980s, largely as a result of the decisions in the 1970s, we found that the food needs were not being met in the United States, that a lot of people were still struggling to need food, and so participation in the programs grew again. Then later on in the 90s, specifically in 1996, important legislation was passed by President Clinton when he signed an act to, quote, end welfare as we know it. A very bold claim that was aiming to reform the way that welfare was structured and administered. And so what it did was it restricted program eligibility, tightened work requirements where people needed to prove that they were working to access these benefits. Overall, it reduced benefits and then also expanded penalties for fraud or any kind of other issues like that. And so as a result, enrollment, as you could guess, fell again in the 1990s. And so really these ups and downs of the food stamp programs bring in another ethical consideration of, more specifically, access versus accountability, where with these programs from the federal government that are, at the end of the day, helping people and getting food to people who need it the most, you want that to be as accessible as possible, where as many people who need it can have access to it. But at the same time, you also want to have accountability, where you're making sure that people are using this program the right way, that they're not taking advantage of it in any way. And then also the federal government has sufficient oversight over the administering of this program. And so you can't let it grow to a point where it's completely out of control and where people are relying on it. And so I definitely connected this to the readings from Murden, talking about the advantages and disadvantages of the general bureaucratic structure, specifically the advantage of like having a predictable behavior in the bureaucracy. That makes it easy to understand how SNAP could be administered in a variety of scenarios and how it should be administered by people throughout the bureaucracy at different levels. At the same time, the disadvantage of the bureaucracy being so inflexible and having so much red tape, it could prevent individuals from receiving the personalized assistance that they need and really accessing the benefits that they are entitled to based on the outlines of the program, which at the end of the day would interfere with the mission of the welfare bureaucracy. So finding a balance between access, accountability, and then the advantages and disadvantages of these programs is essential. So then taking us to current day and what SNAP looks like now. In the 2008 Farm Bill, which was actually enacted through an override of the president's veto, so enough of Congress thought that these provisions were important enough to get passed and to override President Bush's veto. What this bill included was a commitment of $10 billion in food assistance programs over the next 10 years, which obviously shows a large commitment to the importance of this program and the impact that it can have across the country. Another big change is that this was when the program was officially renamed to SNAP, to generally reduce stigma and make people feel more comfortable about accessing these benefits when they need it. And so a lot of the current discussions going around, and as we are having right now in the news, is these debates of cost and dependency versus the nutritional health of the poor, where of course you want to make sure that people are getting the food that they need, specifically nutritious food, accessible food, reliable food, but at the same time this program does have a huge cost. And so how much does the federal government really want to spend to provide these resources? And that's a question that may not have an exact answer, but is definitely heavily debated in our government currently. And then also the issue of dependency. You don't want people to fully rely on these benefits to get them through. You want them working, you want them contributing to the economy. So there's a lot of debates revolving around that aspect as well. And so I connected this to specifically with the 2008 Farm Bill to the reading from Simon, talking about the art of getting things done in the bureaucracy, where essentially explaining that the bureaucracy's art of getting things done does rely on both fact and value judgments. And so in these debates, we see that in the case of food assistance, there is a big debate over the balance of fact, which I would say is just the fact that hunger is a huge issue that is affecting this country. I think most people would agree on. But at the same time, you have these value debates about, should people be given these benefits? Should they be given handouts? And again, how much of a role should the federal government play in that? And so, just wrapping up, as a recap, as you've seen, there's always been debates about the structure and the content, and really the ethical considerations behind these food assistance programs and the bureaucracy. And so, as you may have seen in the news, this year, no SNAP benefits were issued on November 1st of this year because of the government shutdown. And so that leaves 42 million people who are unsure about how they might be able to access food throughout this month. And so I did find this quote that labels these food stamps in this program as a vital lifeline for low-income households, really, regardless of how you might perceive the program. And so I think really the biggest conclusion here is that the bureaucracy really does have a real impact and a large impact on people's lives. So when we have these programs and when they become deeply ingrained into our structure, I think generally it's important to make sure that these programs continue, especially when that need continues to exist. And so understanding these kind of bureaucratic concepts and how they've applied to SNAP debates over time, I think is important for us to take away from this class, from this presentation, and continuing to see that the federal government and the bureaucracy really does have a meaningful impact on people's lives, and every decision does make a difference. So thank you, and my reference to slides right here.